My name is Emily. I am 31 years old, and I will never forget the chilling sound of my cheap, frayed duffel bag hitting the wet gravel of the driveway. It was a freezing November evening, and my father-in-law, Richard, a 65-year-old man who wore his inherited wealth like a weapon, was standing on the porch of his massive estate, looking down at me with absolute disgust. He had literally dragged my belongings out of his guest house, laughing a cold laugh as the zipper on my bag broke, spilling my faded clothes into the mud. I stood there, shivering in the freezing rain, feeling a humiliation so deep it physically burned my chest. He told me I was trash, that my cheap bags matched my cheap pedigree, and that I would never amount to anything in his world. I didn't cry.
Instead, I stared at his smug face, etched every detail of that massive house into my memory, and made a silent vow right then and there. He thought he was throwing out the trash, but he had no idea what I was about to build from the dirt he left me in, and the revenge I was planning would cost him the very ground he was standing on. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from him, I want to take a quick pause and ask you something. I love knowing where my stories travel, so please tell me in the comments, what state or city are you listening from right now? It always amazes me to see how far these videos reach. Now, to understand how we ended up on that wet gravel driveway, I need to take you back to the beginning. My husband, Mark, who is 32 years old now, and I met in college.
Mark was kind, grounded, and completely different from the elitist world he grew up in. You see, Mark's family had money, not just comfortable money, but generational, untouchable wealth. I, on the other hand, grew up in a tiny rented house in Ohio. My parents worked factory jobs, and everything I had, I earned with my own hands. When Mark brought me home to meet his family for the first time, the tension was immediate. Richard took one look at my discounted shoes and my lack of a trust fund and decided right then that I was a gold digger trying to steal his son's future. Those first few years of dating were a nightmare whenever we had to visit his family. Richard would host these lavish dinners and intentionally try to embarrass me. He would ask me loud questions across the long dining table about my parents' financial struggles, or make snide comments about how my college degree was useless because I didn't go to an Ivy League school. I would just sit there, gripping my napkin under the table, trying to keep a polite smile on my face for Mark's sake. Mark always defended me. He would argue with his father, tell him he was being disrespectful, but Richard would just wave his hand and say he was trying to protect the family legacy. It was exhausting. I felt like a bug under a microscope, constantly being judged for things I couldn't control. My best friend Sarah, who is also 31, used to tell me to just walk away. I remember sitting in her beat-up sedan one night, crying my eyes out. Sarah looked at me and said, "Emily, you love Mark, but that old man is going to destroy your mental health if you let him."
But I loved Mark too much to leave. When Mark proposed to me, Richard absolutely lost his mind. He called Mark into his study and gave him a brutal ultimatum. He told Mark that if he married me, he would be completely cut off from the family fortune. No inheritance, no trust fund, no help with buying a house, nothing. Richard thought this would scare Mark into dumping me, or scare me into running away. But Mark didn't even hesitate. He handed his father his credit cards, walked out of that study, and we got married in a small courthouse ceremony with just Sarah and a few friends as witnesses. We were so happy, but we were also incredibly broke. Mark had never had to worry about rent or groceries before, and suddenly we were counting pennies just to keep the lights on in our tiny, drafty apartment. We took whatever jobs we could find.
Mark worked at a hardware store, and I was working as a receptionist at a dental clinic during the day and waiting tables at night. About 2 years into our marriage, things got really desperate. Our landlord raised the rent by an amount we simply couldn't afford, and we were facing eviction. Mark swallowed his pride and reached out to his mother, who secretly convinced Richard to let us stay in the small guest house on their estate for just 2 months while we saved up for a new deposit. Richard agreed, but only so he could torture us. From the moment we moved in, he made our lives a living hell. He would come over unannounced, complain about how we parked our old car, and constantly remind us that we were failures living off his charity. The breaking point happened on that cold November evening. I came home from a double shift, exhausted and smelling like diner food.
Richard was waiting for me. He had found a small scratch on the hardwood floor of the guest house and decided that was enough. He started screaming at me, calling me a careless rat who was destroying his property. That was when he went into the bedroom, grabbed my 2 cheap canvas duffel bags, and started throwing my clothes into them haphazardly. I begged him to stop, telling him Mark would be home soon and we could talk about it, but he wouldn't listen. He dragged the bags out the front door and threw them down the porch steps onto the wet driveway. The zipper on the main bag busted open, and my cheap work uniforms, my worn-out sweaters, and my underwear spilled out into the mud and the freezing rain. That brings us back to that moment I told you about at the start. I stood there shivering, looking at my life scattered in the dirt.
Richard leaned over the porch railing and sneered. "Get your trash off my property, Emily. You and those cheap bags belong in the gutter." When Mark got home 10 minutes later and saw me sitting on the wet gravel trying to salvage my clothes, something inside him broke. He didn't even go inside to yell at his father. He just helped me pack the car and we drove away into the night. We slept in our car for 3 days after that. Those 3 days in the car were the lowest point of my life. I remember crying myself to sleep, wrapped in a damp blanket, feeling like a complete failure. But somewhere in that darkness, my sadness turned into a burning, white-hot anger. I decided that I was never going to let anyone make me feel this helpless ever again. When we finally found a cheap motel that let us pay weekly, I sat down at the sticky desk in the corner and started brainstorming.
I had noticed a massive problem while working at the dental clinic and the diner. Small local businesses had terrible, outdated inventory systems, and they were losing thousands of dollars because of it. I had no background in tech, but I was organized and I knew exactly what these businesses needed. I started designing a simple, user-friendly inventory management software on paper. I showed the sketches to Sarah, who had a cousin in programming. Sarah looked at the messy drawings and said, "Emily, if you can actually build this, people will buy it. It makes too much sense." That was the spark I needed. The next 5 years were an absolute blur of exhaustion and relentless hustle. I kept my job at the dental clinic to pay the bills, but every single night from 7 p.m. until 2 a.m., I was working on the business.
Mark got a better job in sales and took over all the household chores so I could focus. We found a young software developer online who agreed to build the prototype for a small equity stake. I remember the smell of that cramped apartment, the endless cups of cheap instant coffee, and the constant fear that we were wasting our time. I cold called hundreds of businesses. Most of them hung up on me. I got laughed out of meetings because I didn't have a fancy presentation or a slick corporate background, but I kept pushing. I would close my eyes and see Richard's smug face on that porch, and it was like a shot of adrenaline straight to my heart. Every time I wanted to quit, every time I was too tired to send one more email, I remembered the sound of my zipper breaking and my clothes hitting the mud.
Our first big break came after 18 months of grinding. A regional chain of hardware stores, coincidentally the same chain Mark used to work for, agreed to a pilot run of our software. I was so nervous during the pitch that my hands were shaking, but I knew the product inside and out. I showed them exactly how much money they were bleeding every month due to inventory errors, and how my simple system would plug the hole. When they signed the contract, I went out to my car, called Mark, and just sobbed into the steering wheel. That one contract changed everything. It gave us the credibility we needed. Suddenly, people were returning my calls. Other local chains signed up, then a national distributor. We had to hire customer service reps, then a sales team, then more developers. By year 3, my little idea had grown into a multi-million-dollar company. We moved out of our terrible apartment and bought a beautiful home. But I never let the money change my drive. I was still that girl on the wet driveway, working like I had nothing to lose. While my star was rising, Richard's was crashing down in spectacular fashion. We hadn't spoken to him since the night he threw me out, but Mark still kept in touch with a few distant relatives, so we heard the rumors. Richard had always been arrogant, believing that his family's old money was invincible. He started making incredibly risky investments in commercial real estate right before the market took a massive hit. He refused to listen to his financial advisors, treating them with the same disgust he had treated me. He thought he was the smartest man in every room. Over the course of 2 years, his portfolio hemorrhaged millions.
To cover his bad bets, he leveraged the family estate, taking out massive loans against the property that had been in his family for generations. He was absolutely convinced the market would bounce back and he would look like a genius. But it didn't. The banks started calling in their loans, and Richard didn't have the liquid cash to pay them. His arrogance had literally bankrupted him. I was sitting in my corner office one Tuesday afternoon when Mark walked in. He looked pale. He closed the door, sat in the chair across from my desk, and said, "My dad lost everything. The bank is foreclosing on the estate. It's going up for a private auction next month." My heart stopped. The estate, the house with the big porch, the gravel driveway. A wave of emotions hit me. I looked at Mark and asked him how he felt about it. Mark just sighed and said, "He made his bed. I just feel bad for the history of the house, but I don't feel bad for him." I sat there in silence for a few minutes. I looked around my beautiful office, thought about my bank accounts, and an idea started to form in my mind. An idea so crazy and so perfectly poetic that it almost scared me. I called Sarah into the office, explained the situation, and told her what I wanted to do. Sarah's jaw dropped. She laughed a loud, echoing laugh and said, "Emily, you are an absolute savage, and I am here for every single second of it." I immediately called my lawyers. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of secret meetings and legal maneuvers. I hired a specialized real estate attorney, a man named David, who was 50 years old and known for his absolute discretion. I sat in his high-rise office in the city and laid out my entire plan. David reviewed Richard's foreclosure documents and explained that the bank was eager to offload the property quickly to recoup their massive losses. He warned me that buying it wouldn't be cheap and that there would likely be intense competition from commercial developers. I didn't care. I transferred a massive sum of money from my personal accounts into the newly formed trust, making sure we had enough liquid capital to outbid absolutely anyone who tried to step in our way. Mark was incredibly supportive through all of this. He knew how much pain his father had caused me, and he saw this not just as revenge, but as a way to officially close the darkest chapter of our lives. We spent our evenings going over the property lines and the auction rules, making sure there were no loopholes Richard could use to save himself at the last minute. I didn't want Richard to know I was involved, so I had my legal team set up an anonymous LLC to handle the bidding. The auction was held at a private firm in the city. Mark and I didn't attend. We sat in our living room on speakerphone with our lawyer, listening as the bids went back and forth. There were a few wealthy developers trying to buy the land to tear the estate down and build condos, but I wasn't going to let that happen. Every time someone raised the bid, I told my lawyer to counter it immediately. I wanted that house. The price climbed higher and higher, reaching a number that would have made me faint just 5 years ago. But today, it was just a business transaction. A very, very personal business transaction. Finally, the auctioneer called, going once, going twice, sold to the anonymous buyer. When the lawyer confirmed we had won, Mark and I just stared at each other. We owned it. We owned the very ground I was thrown onto. But the best part was yet to come, the handover. The terms of the foreclosure meant Richard had 30 days to vacate the property. My lawyers handled all the paperwork, keeping my name completely off the radar. Richard thought he had lost his family home to some faceless corporate entity. As the 30th day approached, I arranged to do the final walkthrough of the property myself, acting as the representative of the new owner. I wanted to see his face. I wanted to be the one to hand him the final eviction notice. On the morning of the walkthrough, I didn't dress in fancy designer clothes. I put on a simple pair of jeans, a plain sweater, and the exact same brand of cheap canvas shoes I was wearing the night he threw me out. Mark asked if I wanted him to come, but I told him no. This was something I had to do alone. I drove my car up that long, winding gravel driveway. The estate looked a little more run down than I remembered.
The grass was overgrown and the grandness of it all seemed to have faded. I parked right in front of the porch. I walked up the steps and knocked on the heavy wooden door. After a minute, it opened. Richard stood there. He looked 10 years older. He was thinner, his shoulders were slumped, and the arrogant fire in his eyes had been replaced by a hollow exhaustion. He looked at me, confused at first, and then his face twisted into a scowl. "What are you doing here?" he spat, his voice raspy. "If you're here to gloat about my misfortune, you can turn around and leave. You're trespassing on private property." I didn't blink. I just looked him dead in the eye, pulled the thick folder of closing documents from my bag, and held them out to him. "Actually, Richard," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady, "you are the one trespassing. I am the owner of the LLC that purchased this estate. I am the new owner of this house, this land, and that driveway you threw me onto. I'm here for the final walkthrough and to make sure you are off my property by noon." I watched his brain try to process the words. I watched the reality hit him like a physical blow. His hands started to shake. He looked at the documents, saw my signature at the bottom of the deed, and all the color completely drained from his face. He stumbled backward a step, leaning against the doorframe for support. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, this is impossible. You are nothing. You had nothing." I stepped over the threshold, invading his space. "You were right, Richard," I said, my voice echoing in the grand, empty foyer. "I had nothing, but I built an empire while you destroyed yours. You thought my cheap bags meant I had a cheap mind. You were wrong. Now I suggest you grab whatever boxes you have left, because the moving trucks I hired to clear out the rest of the junk are arriving in exactly 20 minutes. He didn't scream. He didn't yell. He just completely crumbled. The big, powerful man who used to terrorize me was gone, replaced by a broken old man who had to watch the trash he threw out take possession of his kingdom. It was the most satisfying silence I have ever experienced. I stood on that porch and watched him carry his own cardboard boxes out to his car. He didn't have movers. He didn't have servants. It was just him, struggling with heavy boxes, dropping things along the way. I didn't lift a finger to help him. I just stood exactly where he had stood 5 years ago, watching him pack his life away. When he finally got into his car and drove down the driveway, he didn't even look back. The moment his car disappeared past the front gates, a massive weight lifted off my shoulders. I walked through the empty halls of the estate. It didn't feel like a haunted house anymore. It just felt like a building. Mark and I decided we didn't want to live there. There were too many bad memories. Instead, we spent the next 6 months completely renovating the main house and the guest house, turning the entire estate into a retreat center for women entrepreneurs who were trying to build their own businesses from the ground up. We transformed a place of arrogance and cruelty into a place of support and growth. Looking back at everything, I realized that the worst moment of my life was actually the greatest gift I could have ever received. If Richard hadn't thrown my cheap bags into the mud, if he hadn't tried to break me, I never would have found the fire inside myself to build the life I have now. Sometimes the people who try to destroy you are the ones who accidentally hand you the blueprint for your own success. I learned that revenge isn't about hurting someone back. True revenge is building a life so incredibly successful that your enemies have no choice but to watch you thrive from the bottom of the hole they dug for themselves. Now, I want to ask you, the listener, a question. If you were in my shoes, standing on that porch with the deed to the house, would you have let him stay? Or would you have kicked him out just like I did? Let me know in the comments below. Until the next story.